3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Wellington Park had transformed into something neither Thomas nor Harold could have imagined. The weekly Veterans Coffee gathering had grown from a handful of people to a thriving community of current service members, veterans from multiple conflicts, and family members who understood the unique challenges of military life. The pavilion that had once been used primarily for tourist information had become an unofficial headquarters for what people were calling the Guardian Circle. Every Wednesday morning, folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle, coffee was brewed in large thermoses, and stories were shared with the kind of honesty that only came from people who had faced life and death together. Harold had become the unofficial leader of these gatherings, though he would have laughed at anyone who suggested such a thing. He simply showed up every week with his bag of breadcrumbs for the pigeons, and his memories of Jimmy Santos and the other friends who hadn't made it home. What had started as reluctant participation had evolved into something approaching healing. The thing about Jimmy, Harold was saying to a group of young soldiers who hung on his every word, was that he understood something most of us had to learn the hard way. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done even when you're scared out of your mind. Thomas, whose new role as community liaison had exceeded all expectations, watched from the edge of the circle with a sense of deep satisfaction. The young guards under his supervision were learning lessons about service and sacrifice that no training manual could teach. They were understanding, through Harold's stories and the experiences of other veterans, that their ceremonial duties were connected to a much larger tradition of service and protection. "Tell them about the night patrol," urged Maria Santos, a young woman whose grandfather had served alongside Harold in Vietnam. She had been one of the first to reach out after hearing about the incident, and her presence had added a deeply personal dimension to Harold's storytelling. Harold's eyes grew distant with memory. This was about 2 weeks after Jimmy was killed. I was still pretty torn up about it, not sleeping much, jumping at every sound. My sergeant decided I needed something to focus on besides my grief, so he assigned me to lead a patrol in a territory we'd been avoiding because of heavy enemy activity. The young soldiers leaned forward, recognizing the setup for a story that would test everything they thought they knew about courage and leadership. We were supposed to be out there for 6 hours, gathering intelligence and looking for signs of enemy movement. 3 hours in, we walked into an ambush that should have killed all of us. They had us pinned down with nowhere to run, and our radio was shot to hell. We couldn't call for backup, couldn't retreat, couldn't advance. We were just stuck there, waiting to die. Thomas had heard this story before, but it never failed to give him chills. He could see the same effect on the faces of the young guards, the recognition that they were hearing about real combat from someone who had lived through it. That's when I heard Jimmy's voice in my head, as clear as if he was sitting right next to me. He said, "Harold, you've got 8 guys depending on you. What are you going to do about it?" And suddenly, I knew. I couldn't save Jimmy, but I could save these 8 soldiers who were looking at me to figure out how we were going to get out of this mess. Sarah Chun, who had become Harold's closest friend and unofficial assistant in organizing these gatherings, squeezed his hand gently. She knew this was the hardest part of the story for him to tell, the part where he had to relive making life and death decisions under impossible circumstances. I told my squad that we were going to create our own extraction. We had enough explosives to take out the machine gun nest that was keeping us pinned down, but someone would have to get close enough to place the charges. Real close. The kind of close where you probably don't make it back. One of the young guards, a kid named Peterson who couldn't have been more than 19, raised his hand tentatively. "Who volunteered?" Harold smiled sadly. They all did. Every single one of them. 8 guys who had families back home, who had dreams and plans and futures ahead of them. And they all volunteered to take the mission that would probably kill them. That's when I understood what Jimmy had been trying to teach us all along. We weren't just soldiers. We were brothers. And brothers don't let brothers die alone. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle cooing of pigeons and the distant sounds of city traffic. Thomas could see that several of the young guards were struggling with emotions they probably hadn't expected to feel during what they thought would be a routine training session. "What happened?" Peterson asked quietly. "I took the mission myself," Harold replied. "Not because I was braver than them, but because I was the only one who didn't have someone waiting for him back home. Jimmy was gone, my parents were both dead, and I figured if someone was going to die that day, it should be the guy with the least to lose. Harold paused to scatter some breadcrumbs for the pigeons, using the familiar ritual to steady himself before continuing with the most difficult part of the story. I made it to the machine gun nest and placed the charges, but I got hit pretty bad on the way back. Shrapnel from their return fire tore up my leg and my arm, and I passed out about 50 yards from my squad's position. When I woke up, I was in a field hospital, and all 8 of my guys were there waiting for me. Turns out they had ignored my orders to retreat and had come after me instead. They disobeyed orders? Asked another guard. Best damn disobedience I ever witnessed, Harold replied with a grin. They carried me back through enemy fire because they understood the same thing Jimmy had tried to teach us. You don't leave your brothers behind. Ever. No matter what the orders say, no matter what the tactical situation looks like, no matter what the cost might be. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he listened to the story. It reminded him of his own decision to abandon his post to defend Harold, the way sometimes the most important choices were the ones that went against official protocols. Mr. Fleming, said a young woman in the crowd, a new recruit named Davis who was still getting used to the weight of her uniform. How do you know when to follow orders and when to follow your conscience? It was the kind of question that drill instructors usually deflected or answered with platitudes about duty and obedience. But Harold had earned the right to give a more complex answer, one that acknowledged the moral ambiguity that real soldiers faced in real situations. That's the hardest part of being a soldier, Harold said thoughtfully. The truth is, most of the time your orders and your conscience point in the same direction. But when they don't, you have to remember what you're really fighting for. Not for politicians or policies or pieces of territory. You're fighting for the person next to you, for the values that made you want to serve in the first place, for the idea that some things are worth protecting even when the cost is high. Thomas nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of lesson he had hoped these gatherings would provide, the kind of moral education that couldn't be taught in classrooms, but had to be passed down from one generation of warriors to the next. The 3 kids who bothered you that day, Davis continued. What do you think they learned from what happened? Harold exchanged a glance with Thomas, remembering the confrontation that had started everything. I hope they learned that actions have consequences, that there are still people in the world who won't stand by and watch others being mistreated. But, mostly, I hope they learned something about respect, for veterans, for elderly people, for anyone who deserves better than what they were getting. Have you seen them since then? Peterson asked. Thomas cleared his throat. Actually, I have some news about that. One of them, the leader of the group, contacted me last week through the police department. He wanted to apologize directly to Mr. Fleming and to ask if there was anything he could do to make amends. Harold looked surprised. Really? Apparently, what happened that day stayed with him. He's been thinking about it for months, and he finally worked up the courage to reach out. He's actually here today, waiting to talk to you if you're willing. Harold looked around the circle of faces, seeing support and encouragement in the eyes of people who had become his extended family. Where is he? Thomas gestured toward the edge of the pavilion, where a young man stood nervously holding a small bouquet of flowers. It was the same kid who had grabbed Harold's arm 3 months earlier, but he looked completely different now. Gone was the swagger and false bravado, replaced by genuine nervousness and what appeared to be sincere remorse. Mr. Fleming, the young man said as he approached the circle, my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm the one who bothered you that day, and I've been wanting to apologize ever since. Harold studied the young man's face, looking for signs of sincerity. What he saw was someone who had clearly been doing some serious thinking about his behavior and its consequences. These are for you, Marcus continued, offering the flowers with shaking hands. And I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the VA hospital since that day. I figured if I was going to disrespect a veteran, the least I could do was try to help some others. Harold accepted the flowers with a gentle smile. That's a good start, son. But what I really want to know is why you were bothering old people in the first place. Marcus flushed red, but maintained eye contact. Honestly, because I was angry and stupid, and I thought picking on people who couldn't fight back would make me feel better about my own problems. I was wrong about everything, about you, about what strength really looks like, about what it means to be a man. And what do you think it means to be a man now? Harold asked. Marcus glanced around the circle of veterans and soldiers, clearly intimidated by the weight of so much experience and wisdom. I think it means standing up for people who need protection, even when it's hard. I think it means taking responsibility for your mistakes and trying to do better. And I think it means understanding that real strength comes from helping others, not hurting them. Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying the young man who had transformed from antagonist to something approaching redemption. Finally, he stood up and extended his hand. Apology accepted, Marcus. And thank you for the work you're doing at the VA. Those veterans need people who understand that service matters. As Marcus shook Harold's hand, the circle of veterans and soldiers erupted in spontaneous applause. It wasn't just appreciation for the apology, but recognition of something much larger, the possibility of transformation, the power of example, and the understanding that sometimes the most important victories were won not on battlefields but in moments of human connection and growth. Thomas watched the exchange with deep satisfaction, knowing that this was exactly what the Guardian Circle had been meant to accomplish. It wasn't just about honoring the past or supporting veterans, though it did both of those things. It was about creating a community where the values of service and sacrifice could be passed on to new generations, where the lessons learned in combat could help civilian society become more compassionate and just. Later, as the morning gathering wound down and people began to disperse, Harold found himself alone with Thomas and Sarah, feeding the last of the breadcrumbs to pigeons who had become as much a part of the community as any of the human members. You know, Harold said, watching a particularly bold pigeon perch on his knee. 3 months ago, I thought my story was over. I thought I was just waiting to die, taking up space in a world that had moved on without me. And now? Thomas asked. Harold smiled, looking around at the pavilion where folding chairs were being stacked and coffee thermoses were being cleaned for next week's gathering. Now I understand that my story isn't over at all. It's just changing chapters. Jimmy Santos and all the others who didn't make it home, their stories don't end with their deaths. They continue through the lives they saved, the people they inspired, the values they passed on to those of us who survived. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what Harold meant. David always said that the most important mission for any veteran was to make sure the next generation understood what service really means. Not the glory or the recognition, but the simple commitment to put others before yourself. Thomas felt the truth of those words settling into his bones like gospel. His own understanding of service had been fundamentally changed by his relationship with Harold and the other veterans who had shared their stories over the past 3 months. He had learned that protecting people wasn't just about standing guard or following orders. It was about recognizing when ordinary human decency required extraordinary action. There's something I want you both to know, Thomas said as they prepared to leave the park. When I made the decision to step away from my post that day, I thought I was risking my career for one moment of doing the right thing. I had no idea it would lead to this, to all of these connections, all of these stories, all of this healing. Harold chuckled. Son, that's the thing about doing the right thing. You never know how far the ripples will spread. Jimmy Santos probably never imagined that his sacrifice would still be inspiring young soldiers 50 years later, but here we are, talking about him like he's still with us. He is still with us, Sarah added quietly. In every story you tell, in every lesson you pass on, in every young person who learns something about courage from hearing about his life. As they walked out of the park together, the 3 unlikely friends carried with them the knowledge that they had become part of something much larger than themselves. They were living proof that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons, but with simple acts of human kindness and recognition. They were guardians not just of monuments and traditions, but of the values that made those monuments and traditions worth protecting in the first place. And, in the distance behind them, a small flock of pigeons settled onto the empty benches, waiting patiently for tomorrow morning when their human friends would return with fresh stories and fresh breadcrumbs, continuing a ritual of memory and hope that had transformed a simple park into a sanctuary for the best of human nature. The days following the confrontation brought unexpected changes to both men's lives. Thomas returned to his ceremonial post the next morning, but something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to serve. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had received several reports about the incident from witnesses, and Thomas expected to face disciplinary action for abandoning his post. Instead, he found himself called into Reynolds' office for a conversation that would reshape his career. "Mitchell," Captain Reynolds began, settling behind his desk with a thoughtful expression, "I've been getting interesting phone calls about yesterday's events. 3 separate witnesses contacted our headquarters to commend your actions. The park's superintendent called personally to thank the Royal Guard Division for having someone willing to step up when needed." Thomas maintained his military bearing but felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. "Sir, I understand I violated protocol by leaving my post. I'm prepared to accept whatever disciplinary action you see fit." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with the kind of penetrating gaze that came from 25 years of military service. "Tell me something, Mitchell. In your 6 years as a Royal Guard, have you ever seen anything that made you question whether standing still was really the best way to serve?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He had expected a reprimand, perhaps even a transfer to a less prestigious assignment. He hadn't expected his commanding officer to ask him to examine the philosophical foundations of his duty. "Honestly, sir," Thomas replied after a moment's consideration, "I've seen a lot of things over the years that made me wish I could intervene. Tourists being harassed, elderly people struggling with heavy bags, children who wandered away from their parents. But I always believed that maintaining our position was more important than individual acts of assistance." "And now?" Reynolds pressed. Thomas thought about Harold, about the dignity in the old veteran's eyes when someone finally treated him with the respect he deserved. "Now I think maybe our position has more value when people see that we're willing to use it to protect those who need protection." Reynolds nodded slowly. "There's something you should know about Harold Fleming, Mitchell. After yesterday's incident, I did some research of my own. Do you know what that man did to earn his Distinguished Service Cross?" "No, sir. I only found basic information about his awards. He held off an entire North Vietnamese company for 3 hours while his unit evacuated wounded. Single-handedly. When they finally overran his position, they found him unconscious from blood loss, but still firing. He saved 43 lives that day, Mitchell. 43 American soldiers went home because Harold Fleming decided that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're outnumbered and outgunned." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He had known Harold was a war hero, but hearing the specifics made his decision to intervene seem even more necessary. "That man has been coming to our park for 8 months, Reynolds continued. 8 months of sitting alone on that bench, and not once has anyone in our unit acknowledged what he represents. Yesterday, you changed that. You reminded everyone watching that we don't just guard buildings and monuments. We guard the principles those buildings and monuments represent." "Sir, are you saying?" "I'm saying that effective immediately, you're being reassigned to community liaison duties. Your new job is to make sure that incidents like yesterday never need to happen again. You'll work with veterans organizations, community groups, and local law enforcement to ensure this park remains a place where heroes like Harold Fleming can find the peace they've earned." Thomas stared at his commanding officer in amazement. "Sir, I don't understand. I violated direct orders." Reynolds smiled. "Son, sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who understand that orders can conflict with duty. Yesterday, you chose duty over orders. That tells me you understand what this uniform really represents." Meanwhile, Harold was experiencing his own transformation. Word of the confrontation had spread through the veterans' community with remarkable speed, and suddenly, the man who had felt invisible for years found himself the center of attention he never expected. His phone, which rarely rang except for telemarketers and doctor's appointments, became a constant source of communication from old comrades he hadn't heard from in decades. The local VFW Post invited him to speak at their monthly meeting. A reporter from the city newspaper wanted to interview him about his wartime service and the incident with the Royal Guard. But the most significant change was in Harold's daily routine. When he arrived at the park for his usual morning visit with the pigeons, he found that he was no longer alone. Sarah Chun, the war widow he had noticed but never spoken to, was waiting for him with her own bag of breadcrumbs. "I hope you don't mind some company," she said with a shy smile. "I've been feeding these birds for 2 years, but I always felt too awkward to approach you." Harold settled onto his usual bench, surprised by how natural it felt to have someone join him. "I don't mind at all. Truth is, I've been wondering about you too. Your husband was military." "Marine Corps," Sarah replied, scattering crumbs for the gathering pigeons. "2 tours in Iraq. He always said that when he came home, he wanted to find a peaceful place where he could just sit and think. This bench would have been perfect for him." They fell into an easy conversation, sharing stories about their respective losses and the challenges of moving forward after unimaginable sacrifice. Harold found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, talking about Jimmy Santos and the other friends he had lost, while Sarah shared memories of her husband David and the dreams they never got to fulfill. "You know what struck me most about yesterday?" Sarah said as they watched the pigeons pecking contentedly around their feet. "It wasn't just that Thomas stood up for you. It was that he understood immediately what you represented, who you were. That kind of recognition is rare these days." Harold nodded, thinking about the young guard's words and actions. "He saw me as a person worth defending. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, who approached the bench with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. He was still in his red uniform, but something about his bearing suggested a different kind of duty than the rigid ceremonial stance he had maintained for years. "Mr. Fleming, Mrs. Chun," he said, offering a respectful nod to both. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to let you know about some changes that are coming to the park." Harold looked up with curiosity. "Changes?" Thomas sat down on the bench across from them, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. "My commanding officer has assigned me to work with veterans groups and community organizations to make sure this park serves the people who need it most. Starting next week, we'll be hosting a weekly veterans coffee gathering right here in the pavilion. Nothing formal, just a chance for people to connect with others who understand what service means." Sarah's eyes lit up with interest. "That sounds wonderful." David always said the hardest part of coming home wasn't adjusting to civilian life. It was feeling disconnected from people who understood what he'd been through. "Exactly," Thomas replied. "And we're also going to be working with local law enforcement to increase patrols in this area. What happened the other day shouldn't happen to anyone, but especially not to people who've already sacrificed so much for this country." Harold felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just for himself, but for other veterans who might be struggling with the same sense of isolation and invisibility that had plagued him for so long. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Mr. Fleming, I was wondering if you'd be willing to share some of your stories with the younger guards. A lot of us joined the service because we wanted to honor the sacrifices of people like you, but we've never had the chance to hear firsthand what that sacrifice really looks like." Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering the request. The idea of talking to groups of young soldiers about his experiences was both appealing and terrifying. He had spent so many years keeping those memories locked away, sharing them only with the pigeons who couldn't judge or question or offer unwanted sympathy. "I'm not much of a public speaker," he said finally. "You don't need to be," Thomas replied. "You just need to be honest. Tell them what Jimmy Santos was like. Tell them about the friends you lost and the friends you saved. Help them understand that the uniform they wear connects them to something bigger than ceremony and tradition." Sarah reached over and squeezed Harold's hand. "I think it's a beautiful idea. David used to say that the stories of the people who came before us are what give meaning to our own service." Harold looked around the park, seeing it with new eyes. For months, this had been his refuge from a world that seemed to have no place for him. Now, suddenly, it was becoming something else, a bridge between his past and a future he hadn't dared to imagine. "All right," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I'll do it. But I want to make sure they understand something important. Being a hero isn't about the medals or the recognition. It's about looking out for the person next to you, even when you're scared, even when it costs you everything. That's what Jimmy taught me, and that's what I want them to know." Thomas smiled, and Harold could see the same sense of purpose in the young guard's eyes that he remembered feeling in Vietnam when everything seemed hopeless but They kept fighting anyway, because that's what you did for your brothers. I think Jimmy would be proud, Thomas said, of what you're doing, of who you've become, of the impact you're going to have on the next generation of people willing to serve. As the three of them sat together, feeding pigeons and planning ways to honor the sacrifices of those who had served, Harold felt something shifting in his understanding of what it meant to be a survivor. Maybe his job wasn't just to carry the memory of the fallen. Maybe it was to pass on their stories, their values, their understanding of what it truly meant to serve something bigger than yourself. The silence stretched on for several tense moments as the young man weighed his options. Thomas's grip remained firm but not cruel, a perfect demonstration of controlled force that spoke to years of professional training. Harold watched the interaction with growing amazement, still hardly believing that someone had stepped forward to defend him. "I'm waiting," Thomas said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made it clear his patience was not unlimited. Finally, the leader broke. The combination of physical discomfort, public embarrassment, and the growing crowd of disapproving onlookers had stripped away his false bravado. Okay. I'm sorry, old man. We didn't mean anything by it." Thomas's expression didn't change. "That's not an apology. That's barely even an acknowledgement. Try again, and this time remember that Mr. Fleming has a name and deserves your respect." Harold felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. When was the last time someone had demanded that he be treated with dignity? When was the last time anyone had seen him as more than just an invisible old man taking up space? The young man grimaced as Thomas adjusted his grip slightly. "Mr. Fleming," he said through gritted teeth, "I apologize for bothering you. We were out of line." Thomas looked to Harold, clearly waiting for the veteran's response. Harold studied the young man's face for a moment, seeing past the anger and embarrassment to something else underneath. Fear, yes, but also confusion. This kid was probably from a generation that had never learned to respect their elders, never been taught that veterans deserved special consideration. "Apology accepted," Harold said quietly. His voice was steadier than it had been in months, strengthened by the knowledge that he had an ally in this confrontation. "But maybe next time you see an old veteran in the park, you could just leave him in peace." Thomas released the young man's wrist, but his posture remained alert and ready. "Now, about leaving this park. I think that would be a very good idea." The three thugs began backing away, clearly eager to escape further humiliation. But the leader couldn't resist one final show of defiance. "This isn't over, toy soldier. We know where you work." Thomas stepped forward again, and this time there was nothing ceremonial about his bearing. He was pure military precision, a weapon temporarily sheathed but ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. "Actually, it is over. And if I see you bothering Mr. Fleming or anyone else in this park, we'll continue this conversation under much less pleasant circumstances." The three young men hurried away, their swagger completely deflated. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse as well, though many stopped to shake hands with both Thomas and Harold, offering words of support and appreciation. Sarah Chun, the widow Harold had noticed before, approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said to Thomas. "What you did was beautiful. My husband would have been proud to serve alongside someone like you." An older gentleman with a Vietnam veteran's cap stepped forward next. "Son," he said to Thomas, "that was the finest display of military bearing I've seen outside of active duty. You honored your uniform and your oath today." Harold felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. For months, he had been invisible in this park, just another piece of human furniture that people walked around without really seeing. Now, suddenly, he was the center of a small celebration of respect and recognition. Thomas seemed equally moved by the response, though he maintained his professional composure. "Thank you all," he said. "But the real honor belongs to Mr. Fleming. I just did what any decent person should do when they see a veteran being disrespected." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Thomas found himself alone with Harold for the first time since the confrontation began. The elderly veteran was sitting back down on his bench, but his posture was different now. Straighter, more confident. The defeated slump in his shoulders had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like pride. "How did you know?" Harold asked as Thomas approached the bench. "About my service, I mean. About what I did in the war." Thomas sat down beside Harold, a gesture that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier when he was bound by the rigid protocols of his ceremonial duty. "I looked you up," he admitted. "After watching you come here every morning for months, I got curious. I wanted to know your story." Harold stared at him in amazement. "You've been watching me?" "Part of my job is observing everything that happens in this area," Thomas explained. "But you became more than just another face in the crowd. The way you carried yourself, the respect you showed for the memorial, the way you treated even the pigeons with such gentle care. I recognized something in you that reminded me of why I wanted to serve in the first place." Harold's eyes filled with tears. "I thought no one cared anymore. I thought the world had forgotten about people like me." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Never. There are those of us who understand what you sacrificed, what you've been through. We may not always speak up, but we see you. We remember." The pigeons, who had scattered during the confrontation, began to return cautiously to the bench. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bag of breadcrumbs, his hands steadier now than they had been in months. "Tell me about them," Thomas said, watching as Harold began to feed the birds. "Your war stories. Your service. I'd like to hear it from someone who was actually there." Harold looked at the young guard with surprise. It had been years since anyone had asked about his experiences with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Most people, when they learned about his military background, either changed the subject quickly or asked the kind of shallow questions that showed they didn't really want to know the answers. "Are you sure?" Harold asked. "It's not always pleasant. War stories rarely are." "I'm sure," Thomas replied. "I've served too, though nothing like what you went through. But I understand that sometimes the most important stories are the hardest ones to tell." Harold scattered a handful of breadcrumbs and watched as the pigeons gathered around his feet. "Well," he began slowly, "it started in 1968. I was 19 years old and thought I knew everything about the world. The Army taught me different pretty quickly." Over the next hour, Harold shared stories he hadn't told in years. He talked about the friends he had lost, the battles he had survived, the moments of terror and courage that had shaped him into the man he became. Thomas listened with the kind of respectful attention that made Harold feel like his experiences mattered, like his service had meaning beyond the faded medals in his bedroom drawer. "There was this one kid in my unit," Harold said, his voice growing distant with memory. "Jimmy Santos from Texas. Couldn't have been more than 18. But he had this way of keeping everyone's spirits up, even in the worst situations. He used to say that no matter how bad things got, as long as we took care of each other, we'd be okay." Thomas could hear the emotion in Harold's voice and recognized the weight of survivor's guilt that so many veterans carried. "What happened to Jimmy?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, feeding the pigeons with mechanical precision. "Ambush outside of Da Nang. He threw himself on a grenade to save the rest of us. 19 years old. And he made a choice to sacrifice himself for his brothers. I think about him every day. He sounds like a hero," Thomas said. "They all were," Harold replied. "Every single one of them. The ones who came home and the ones who didn't. But somehow, I'm the only one people call a hero, and I'm the one who survived. Doesn't seem fair, does it?" Thomas understood that Harold was sharing something profound with him, a truth that the elderly veteran probably hadn't spoken aloud in years. This wasn't just about war stories or military service. This was about guilt and loss and the terrible weight of being a survivor. "Mr. Fleming," Thomas said carefully, "what you did over there, the lives you saved, the service you gave to your country, that matters. It doesn't matter less because you survived to tell the story. If anything, it matters more because you're here to remember the ones who can't speak for themselves." Harold looked at Thomas with something approaching wonder. This young man, barely 30 years old, somehow understood truths that Harold had been struggling with for 50 years. He understood that survival could be its own kind of burden, that living with the memory of the dead required a different kind of courage than dying with them. "You know what the hardest part is?" Harold asked. "It's not the nightmares or the flashbacks or any of that. It's feeling like the world has moved on without us. Like all that sacrifice, all that pain, doesn't mean anything to people anymore." Thomas nodded. "I think that's why what happened today was so important. Not just because those kids needed to be taught some respect, but because you needed to see that there are still people who understand what your service means, who honor what you and your friends went through." Harold scattered the last of his breadcrumbs and watched as the pigeons pecked at them with gentle contentment. You know, Jimmy would have liked you. He always said the best soldiers were the ones who looked out for people who couldn't look out for themselves. Then, I'm honored by the comparison, Thomas replied. And I hope I can live up to it. As they sat together on the bench, watching the pigeons and the peaceful morning activity of the park, both men felt something shifting in their understanding of duty and service. For Thomas, it was a recognition that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons, but with simple acts of human decency. For Harold, it was a reminder that his story mattered, that his service had meaning, and that there were still people in the world who understood the difference between surviving and truly living. The sound of Thomas's military boots on the cobblestone path cut through the morning air like a knife. Every step was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of 6 years of rigid discipline suddenly, transformed into purposeful action. The tourists who had been trying to photograph him moments earlier stared in amazement as the supposedly immovable royal guard began walking with unmistakable intent. The 3 young men harassing Harold were so focused on their victim that they didn't notice Thomas approaching until his shadow fell across their little circle. The leader looked up, annoyed at the interruption, expecting to see another park visitor he could intimidate into moving along. Instead, he found himself staring at 6 feet of trained military precision wrapped in a red ceremonial uniform. Thomas's face remained expressionless, but there was something in his eyes that made the young man's swagger falter. This wasn't some random bystander. This was a soldier, and he was clearly not pleased with what he was seeing. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of command training. "I believe you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." The leader tried to recover his composure, puffing up his chest in a display of false bravado. "Back off, toy soldier. This doesn't concern you." Thomas took another step closer. He was now close enough that the 3 young men could see the details of his uniform. The perfect creases, the gleaming brass buttons, the various insignia that marked him as someone who took his responsibility seriously. More importantly, they could see the way he carried himself, with the balanced readiness of someone who had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than this. "Actually," Thomas said, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge that sent chills down Harold's spine, "it concerns me very much. You see, this gentleman you're bothering is a war hero. He served his country with honor and distinction. And right now, you're disrespecting not just him, but everything he fought for." Harold looked up at Thomas in amazement. How did this young guard know about his military service? How had he learned about battles fought in jungles half a world away, medals earned through blood, and sacrifice that Harold rarely spoke about anymore? The leader of the thugs wasn't impressed. If anything, the mention of Harold's military service seemed to anger him further. "War hero? You mean this old fool who sits here talking to pigeons all day? Give me a break. The only thing he's fighting now is senility." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Harold, with his combat experience, recognized it immediately. It was the subtle adjustment of a warrior preparing for battle, the almost imperceptible settling of weight and balance that preceded violence. "I'm going to give you one chance," Thomas said, his words carrying the finality of an ultimatum. "You're going to apologize to Mr. Fleming, and then you're going to walk away. Right now." The second thug, who had been silent until now, tried to assert himself. "Who do you think you are, telling us what to do? You're just some guy in a costume playing dress-up for tourists." Thomas turned his attention to the speaker, and the young man immediately wished he had kept his mouth quiet. There was something in the Royal Guard's gaze that spoke of serious training and real experience. This wasn't a man playing soldier for show. This was a professional warrior who had simply been standing still for a while. "My name is Thomas Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small space between them. "I'm a Royal Guard, which means I've sworn an oath to protect and serve. More importantly, I'm a veteran myself, which means I understand exactly what this man has sacrificed for people like you." Harold felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Someone was standing up for him. Someone understood what his service had meant, what it had cost him, what it continued to cost him every day. For so long, he had felt invisible, forgotten, dismissed as just another old man taking up space in a world that had moved on without him. The third thug, who had been hanging back, decided this was getting out of hand. "Come on, guys, this isn't worth the trouble. Let's just go." But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride had been challenged in front of his friends, and he couldn't let that slide without losing face. "I don't care what kind of uniform you're wearing, toy soldier. You can't tell us what to do." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. "You're right about one thing. I can't force you to do the right thing. But I can explain what's going to happen if you don't." He took a step closer, and now he was well within the personal space of all three young men. None of them moved away, but Harold could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They had come to the park looking for an easy target, someone who wouldn't fight back. They hadn't expected to encounter someone who radiated the kind of competence that suggested fighting back would be the least of their problems. "Here's what you need to understand," Thomas continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Mr. Fleming here has seen more real combat than all three of you combined will ever imagine. He's faced down enemies who were trying to kill him with actual weapons, in actual wars, where the stakes were life and death. Do you think he's afraid of three punk kids who probably still live with their mothers?" Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, someone truly understanding who he had been, who he still was beneath the weight of years and trauma. This young guard wasn't just defending him. He was honoring him, acknowledging the warrior that still lived inside the tired old man feeding pigeons in the park. The leader's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "You think you're tough? You think that uniform makes you special? I'll show you what I think of your fancy costume." He reached out to grab Thomas's jacket, but what happened next was so fast that most of the gathering crowd missed it entirely. Thomas caught the young man's wrist in a grip that stopped his motion instantly. There was no struggle, no visible effort on Thomas's part, but the thug found himself completely unable to move his hand. "Bad choice," Thomas said quietly. "Now I have to explain some things you really should have learned before you decided to bother a war hero." Harold watched in fascination as Thomas applied what was clearly a professional restraint hold. The young man's face went white as he realized he was completely at the mercy of someone who had obviously been trained to handle much more serious threats. "First lesson," Thomas said, his voice remaining perfectly calm despite the fact that he now had complete control of the situation. "Military training doesn't end when you put on a ceremonial uniform. The skills are still there. The discipline is still there. The willingness to use both when necessary is definitely still there." The other two thugs started to move forward to help their friend, but Thomas's free hand came up in a gesture that stopped them cold. It wasn't threatening in any obvious way, but there was something about the movement that suggested they really didn't want to find out what would happen if they took another step. "Second lesson," Thomas continued, adjusting his grip slightly and causing the young man to gasp in pain. "When you disrespect a veteran, you're not just insulting one person. You're insulting everyone who has ever put their life on the line for this country. And some of us take that very personally." A crowd was beginning to gather now, drawn by the commotion. Harold could see office workers stopping on their way to work, joggers slowing down to see what was happening, tourists pulling out their phones to record what looked like it might be a very unusual tourist attraction. "Third lesson," Thomas said, and now his voice carried just a hint of steel. "Mr. Fleming earned the right to sit on this bench in peace through 3 tours of combat duty and enough decorations to fill a display case. What have you done to earn the right to bother him?" The young man in Thomas's grip was beginning to panic. He had expected to intimidate an old man and maybe steal some pocket money. He hadn't expected to find himself in the hands of someone who clearly knew exactly how much pressure to apply to cause maximum discomfort without actually causing injury. "Let me go," he gasped. "This is assault. I'll call the police." Thomas smiled for the first time since leaving his post. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Please do. I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about 3 young men harassing a decorated war veteran. I'm equally sure they'll be fascinated by your explanation of how you ended up in this position." Harold felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. It was pride, pure and simple. Not pride in himself, though that was part of it, but pride in the young man who had abandoned his post to defend a stranger. pride in the knowledge that there were still people in the world who understood what service meant, who honored the sacrifices of those who had come before. The second thug tried a different approach. "Look, man, we were just talking to the old guy. We weren't going to hurt him or anything. You're overreacting." Thomas turned his attention to the speaker, and Harold could see the young man wilt under the royal guard's steady gaze. "Is that what you call grabbing someone's arm against their will? Just talking? I must have missed that lesson in social interaction." The crowd was growing larger now, and Harold could hear murmurs from the gathering spectators. Some were expressing concern about the situation. Others were clearly enjoying the show. Most interesting to Harold were the voices of other veterans in the crowd, men and women who recognized what was happening and were voicing their support for both Thomas and Harold. "That's right, show those punks what's what," an older woman called out. Harold recognized her as Sarah Chun, another regular park visitor who had lost her husband in the Gulf War. She had always nodded politely to Harold during his morning visits, but they had never spoken. "About time someone stood up to these troublemakers," added a middle-aged man whose military bearing suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "They've been causing problems in this park for weeks." Thomas seemed to be aware of the growing crowd, but didn't let it distract him from the situation at hand. If anything, the presence of witnesses seemed to strengthen his resolve. These weren't just random bystanders anymore. They were his community, and part of his job was making sure that community was safe for people like Harold. "Now," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly to everyone watching, "here's how this is going to work. You three are going to apologize to Mr. Fleming for disturbing his morning. Then, you're going to leave this park and think very carefully about whether bothering elderly veterans is really the kind of life choice you want to make." The leader was still trapped in Thomas's grip, his face red with pain and embarrassment. The crowd was clearly on the side of the uniformed guard and the elderly veteran, and any hope of talking his way out of this situation was rapidly disappearing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Wellington Park as Thomas Mitchell took his familiar position outside the Royal Memorial Gates. At 28, he had spent 6 years as a Royal Guard, his red uniform pristine, his bearing perfect, his dedication unwavering. The tourists would come and go, snapping photos and trying to make him smile. But Thomas remained stone-faced, a living statue representing centuries of tradition and honor. But Thomas had a secret. While his eyes stared straight ahead, never moving, never acknowledging the world around him, he was always watching, always observing. It was part of his training, yes, but it had become something more. He had learned to read people, to see the stories written in their faces, their posture, their movements. And for the past 8 months, he had been particularly aware of one person. Harold Fleming was 73 years old, though he looked older. Every morning at precisely 9:15, Harold would shuffle into the park carrying a small paper bag filled with breadcrumbs. His destination was always the same, the wooden bench directly across from where Thomas stood guard. Harold would sit there for exactly 1 hour, feeding the pigeons and staring at the memorial wall where hundreds of names were carved in stone. Thomas had done his research. During his off hours, he had looked up Harold Fleming and discovered a war hero hiding in plain sight. Harold had served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Distinguished Service Cross. The man sitting on that bench had crawled through jungle hell, had saved lives under fire, had carried wounded comrades to safety when lesser men would have run. But that was 50 years ago. Now Harold was just another forgotten veteran, struggling with memories that wouldn't fade and a world that had moved on without him. Thomas could see it in the way Harold's hands shook when he opened the bag of breadcrumbs. He could see it in the way the old man's eyes would lose focus, staring at something only he could see. Most of all, Thomas could see it in the careful way Harold avoided looking at other people, as if he believed himself unworthy of their attention. The pigeons knew Harold well. They would gather around his feet the moment he sat down, cooing and strutting with the confidence of creatures who had learned to trust. Harold spoke to them in quiet whispers, telling them about his day, about his dreams, about the friends who hadn't made it home. To anyone watching, it might have seemed sad or even slightly crazy. But Thomas understood. Sometimes talking to pigeons was easier than talking to people who couldn't possibly understand what you'd been through. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. Thomas had developed an instinct for trouble during his years of service, and that instinct was humming like a tuning fork. The usual crowd was there. Office workers cutting through the park on their way to work, joggers following their morning routines, early tourists already snapping photos. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. 3 young men had been lingering near the park entrance for the past 20 minutes. They were trying to look casual, but Thomas could see the calculation in their movements. They were hunting, scanning the crowd for easy targets, looking for vulnerability they could exploit. Thomas had seen their type before, opportunistic predators who fed on the weak and the unwary. Harold arrived right on schedule, carrying his small bag of breadcrumbs. As always, he nodded politely to Thomas as he passed, a gesture of respect from one serviceman to another, though Thomas could never acknowledge it. Harold made his way to his usual bench and began his morning ritual. The 3 young men noticed Harold immediately. Thomas watched as they exchanged glances, their body language shifting from casual to predatory. The leader of the group, a lanky kid with multiple tattoos and the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences, nudged his companions and started walking toward Harold. Thomas felt his muscles tense, though his expression never changed. His training had taught him to remain motionless, to never break character, to be a symbol rather than a person. But his instincts were screaming that something bad was about to happen, and every fiber of his being wanted to intervene. Harold was completely unaware of the approaching danger. He was focused on a particularly bold pigeon that had perched on the arm of his bench, speaking to it in the same gentle tone he used with all his feathered friends. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Harold whispered. "Reminds me of a kid from my unit, Johnny Martinez. Smallest guy in the squad, but he'd charge machine gun nests if you asked him to." The 3 young men were close now, close enough that Thomas could hear their conversation. They were discussing Harold like he wasn't even human, debating whether the old man might have anything worth stealing, making crude jokes about easy targets and senior citizens. "Look at this old fool, talking to birds," the leader said, his voice loud enough to embarrass Harold. "Bet he's got a wallet full of pension money just sitting there." Harold heard them but pretended not to. His hands began to shake more noticeably as he continued feeding the pigeons, but he kept his eyes down, hoping they would lose interest and move on. It was a survival tactic he had learned over the years. Make yourself small, avoid confrontation, hope the predators find easier prey. But Thomas could see that these particular predators weren't going to give up easily. They had picked Harold because he looked vulnerable, because he was alone, because they believed he wouldn't fight back. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no understanding of the steel that still ran through Harold's spine despite his age and his struggles. The leader sat down on Harold's bench uninvited, deliberately crowding the older man. "Nice morning, isn't it, Pops? Must be nice being retired, just sitting around feeding rats with wings all day." Harold's voice was quiet when he responded. "They're just pigeons, son. They don't hurt anybody." "Son?" The young man laughed. "You hear that, guys? The old-timer thinks he can call me son." He leaned closer to Harold, invading his personal space. "How about you show some respect to your betters, old man?" Thomas watched Harold's reaction with growing concern. The elderly veteran was shrinking into himself, his shoulders hunching, his breathing becoming shallow. This wasn't fear of physical harm. Harold had faced down enemies with real weapons. This was something deeper, a kind of spiritual exhaustion that came from years of being invisible, years of feeling like the world no longer had a place for people like him. "I don't want any trouble," Harold said quietly. "I'll just go somewhere else." "Oh no, you don't get to just walk away," the leader said, grabbing Harold's arm as he started to stand. "We're having a conversation here. And conversations go 2 ways, don't they, boys?" The other 2 young men moved closer, forming a triangle around Harold. They weren't being overtly threatening yet, but the intimidation was clear. They were betting that Harold would be too frightened or too proud to call for help, that he would simply endure whatever they had planned rather than cause a scene. Thomas felt something burning in his chest, a rage that threatened to break through years of disciplined training. He had sworn an oath to remain motionless, to be a ceremonial guardian rather than an active protector. But he had sworn other oaths too, earlier in his life, when he first decided to serve his country and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Harold was trying to pull his arm free, but the young man's grip was firm. "Please," Harold said. "I'm just an old man feeding pigeons. I don't have anything you want." "Oh, I think you do," the leader said, his free hand moving toward Harold's jacket pocket where the outline of a wallet was visible. "I think you've got exactly what we want." The pigeons, sensing the tension, had begun to scatter. Only the boldest few remained, strutting around Harold's feet as if they understood that their friend needed support. Harold looked down at them with something like desperation, as if these simple creatures were his only allies in a world that had turned hostile. Thomas made a decision that would change everything. It went against his training, against his orders, against everything he had been taught about his role as a royal guard. But sometimes, he realized, there were things more important than tradition. Sometimes, honor demanded action rather than silence. The moment had come. Thomas could feel it building like electricity in the air. He had spent 8 months watching Harold Fleming sit on that bench, recognizing in the elderly veteran the same dedication to service that drove Thomas to stand guard day after day. He had seen Harold's quiet dignity, his gentle treatment of the pigeons, his respectful nods that acknowledged their shared bond as men who had sworn to protect others. And now Harold needed protection, not from enemy soldiers or foreign threats, but from predators in his own community who saw his age and his isolation as weaknesses to exploit. Thomas understood with crystal clarity that this was his moment of truth. This was when he would discover what kind of man he really was beneath the ceremonial uniform. The leader's hand was moving closer to Harold's pocket. The other 2 thugs were positioning themselves to block any escape routes. Harold was looking around desperately, searching for someone who might help. But the other people in the park were deliberately avoiding eye contact, not wanting to get involved in what looked like trouble. Harold's eyes met Thomas's for just a moment. In that instant, Thomas saw not just fear, but a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke to decades of disappointment. Harold had stopped expecting help from others long ago. He had learned to endure whatever came his way, to absorb punishment and injustice without complaint, because that's what the world had taught him to do. But Thomas had learned different lessons. He had learned that some silences needed to be broken, that some traditions needed to be honored by their violation, that sometimes the most faithful thing a guardian could do was step away from his post to defend what truly mattered. The red-uniformed royal guard took his first step forward in 6 years of service, and everything changed. Picture this. A decorated war veteran sits quietly on a park bench, feeding pigeons with trembling hands that once held rifles in distant battlefields. His uniform jacket, though worn and faded, still bears the patches of honor he earned through blood and sacrifice. To most people walking by, he's invisible, just another old man lost in memories of a war most have forgotten. But across the courtyard stands someone who notices everything. A royal guard, trained to observe, trained to protect, trained to maintain the sacred silence that comes with his position. For months, he has watched this veteran's daily ritual, seeing the pain behind weathered eyes, recognizing the unmistakable signs of a warrior carrying burdens too heavy for one man to bear alone. Today, that silence will be broken. Today, when a young thug decides that an elderly veteran makes an easy target, everything will change. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a guardian can do isn't just stand watch. It's step forward when honor demands action. What happens when duty meets compassion? When training meets heart? When a guard sworn to silence finds his voice at exactly the moment someone needs to hear it most? This is that story. This is the day a royal guard reminded everyone watching what it truly means to serve and protect.